evening, everyone. Welcome to the first standing room only crowd that I remember since I've been in this position. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to those who are in the pit watching this over streaming. We really appreciate it. My name is Janet Levitt. I'm the Dean of the University of Tulsa College of Law, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you here to the College of Law for the 16th annual John Hager Distinguished Lecture, and it's my particular honor to introduce Professor Lawrence Lessig, a preeminent scholar, reformer, and activist. Professor Lessig's commitment to ethical reforms makes him an ideal speaker for a lecture series named in memory of one of our institutional standard bearers, John Hager. Hager was a member of the College of Law's faculty from 1950 to 1989. Former students and colleagues remember Professor Hager not only as TU's resident king of torts, but also, and I hear the chuckles because wherever I go in the community, I have students who talk about the king of torts. But he was also a model of professional and personal integrity. As we carry on in his spirit, we are honored this evening to welcome many outstanding jurists, mentors, and friends. Through the Hager Lecture Series, we have welcomed to campus a full spectrum of legal scholars. The stories that we have shared from this podium have enhanced our discourse and challenged us to question our underlying assumptions and worldviews. Tonight, we are pleased to continue the tradition as we welcome this year's Hager Lecturer. Lawrence Lessig is a professor of law at the Harvard Law School and director of the Edmund J. Safra Foundation Center for Ethics at Harvard University. For much of his career, Professor Lessig has been highly regarded as a technology activist and as an avid supporter of open source software and net neutrality. If there's one irrefutable statement, or perhaps understatement, that one can make about Professor Lessig, it is that he does not tackle small problems. Indeed, his idea-driven advocacy has locked horns with the very biggest issues of our time. In his book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, he demonstrates by means of elegant, vivid, and readable arguments that computer codes can threaten to control our lives just as powerfully as legal codes. In Free Culture, The Nature and Future of Creativity, Lessig argues that copyright terms have grown out of all proportion to any creativity they arguably stimulate. And in Remix, Making Art and Commerce Thrive in the Hybrid Economy, he challenges our intellectual property laws as criminally constraining the day-to-day creativity of youth. In all of these challenges, Lessig shows a boldness of thought, compassion in diagnosis, and flexible ingenuity in prescribing cures. His advocacy has taken many pragmatic forms as well. He led or was significantly involved in Eldred versus Ashcroft and Golan versus Holder, as well as many other major cases, including one that our Professor Robert Spoo participated in. In these cases, he sought to roll back what he viewed as the harmful overextension of copyright laws that have increasingly lost sight of the importance of the public domain. Professor Lessig's current work, which is focused on political and institutional corruption, is quite timely during this election cycle. In his most recent book, Republic Lost: How Money Corrupts Congress and a Plan to Stop It, he takes on one of the most intractable problems that face us today, what he characterizes as dependence, corruption, and politics. This is not bribery or other criminal quid pro quo, but rather an entirely legal and pervasive skewing of our political institutions by institutionalized addiction to money. The biggest issues of the day, healthcare reform, banking regulations, fair voting, all come under Professor Lessig's tolerant but rigorous scrutiny. Tonight, we are privileged to hear his lecture on the ideal of independence. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lawrence Lessig.
Thank you, Dean Levitt, and thank you for inviting me to Tulsa, my first time here, and I'm eager to see as much of the city as I can before I fling myself out tomorrow morning. But I want to talk tonight about an idea that's central to our legal tradition, constitutional tradition, but increasingly forgotten in our political practice. And this is the conception of independence that was at the birth of our republic. So to do that, I want to offer you two introductory ideas on the way to an argument, and finally with a conclusion about what I think we need to do about the loss of this conception of independence. And the first of these ideas is this idea of independence. So the framers of our Constitution were obsessed with the idea of independence. And by independence, I don't mean the idea that's evoked by the year 1776. I don't mean our liberation from Britain. Instead, I mean a conception of independence that was increasingly at the center of America's attention circa 1786, a couple years before we drafted and finally ratified our Constitution, when most in the United States were convinced that America was a failure, that a certain lack of independence and improper dependence had increasingly sprouted up among the state governments, debilitating the state and the federal confederation from achieving any of its objectives. Jefferson described this pattern of dependence as begetting subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambitions. This is what government had become. And what they sought was non-dependent, independent government that could find the right answer for the right reason. Their common aim was a set of institutions, we could say constitutions, against improper dependence. But what's interesting and important to recognize is what that means. What improper dependence means is for proper dependence. Independence here means the proper dependence. So think, for example, about what we mean by an independent judiciary. An independent judiciary does not mean a judiciary that gets to do whatever the hell it wants. What an independent judiciary is, a judiciary that is dependent upon the law. It is that proper dependence that defines its independence. And that's true, I want to suggest, here and elsewhere. And what our framers tried to do was to use constitutions as architects to produce this proper dependence. So my favorite example outside of this in this Constitution can be seen in the background by recognizing what exactly we were writing and drafting against. So the British Crown, King George III, was the quintessential example of a government that had lost any sense of independence. Every branch of that government was dependent upon the king, as the king would use his privileges to buy ministers and buy members of the government so that no branch could act against that king. We, in contrast, built a government with branches of government, none dependent upon the other, and in this sense, they were independent. Instead, these branches of government, founded underneath with a constitution, looked to two sources of dependence control. So the courts were to be exclusively dependent upon the law, and the Congress was to be exclusively dependent upon the people, and the executive was interestingly dependent upon both the law and the people. Now, this is the conception of dependence that is producing the proper kind of independence for this government. And it's not just in some abstract sense. Indeed, there are very specific clauses in our Constitution aiming for precisely this kind of independence. My favorite is this clause, a little bit hard to see, but in Article 1, Section 9, the Constitution says, "And no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state." Now, this clause was inspired by Ben Franklin, who in 1784, while minister in France, received a diamond-encrusted painting from the King of France. This was a practice of ministers in Europe. Louis XVI gave it to him, also gave it to Arthur Lee in the form of a snuff box. And there grew in the United States a fear that our ministers, our ambassadors, would develop the wrong kind of dependency on foreign princes or foreign kings, that they would have a business model of being an ambassador, which was to keep the king happy so that after they left their position, maybe they would have a position benefit from that king. And in this way, they would lose their focus on their objective as an ambassador, a focus on serving the nation rather than serving their foreign prince. And so as to avoid that kind of improper dependency, we enact in our Constitution this clause to destroy that dependence and produce the right kind of independence. Okay, so again, this is the point. This is what independence must mean. We protect independence by avoiding the wrong dependence and securing the right dependence. All right, that's the first idea. Here's the second. I want you to see the way in which trust is a function of independence. Right, so take this chemical, which I'm sure most of you recognize as bisphenol A or BPA. This is the chemical which is in our lives, pervasively in our lives. Everything, I'm sure even this bottle, is filled with BPA as a byproduct of the packaging and bottling that is typically the way in which we consume our food. People have asked the question whether BPA is safe. Most of us think, of course, it must be safe. How could it be everywhere if it weren't safe? So we have governments, they're supposed to protect us, so if it's not safe, it wouldn't be here, and if it is here, that means it must be safe. But in fact, the research about BPA is contested. And if you look at the pattern of this research, it suggests something that I suggest will change your views about the safety of BPA. You distinguish between industry-funded research and independently funded research, and research that finds harm and research that finds no harm, a not surprising pattern can be noticed here. Industry-funded research finds no harm, none of it finds any harm, and independently funded research, significantly higher proportion, finds harm. And now you are less sure about the safety of BPA. Or think about cell phones. Are cell phones safe? These little microwave-emitting devices that we place within a centimeter of our brain, are they safe? 70% of us are sure they're safe. They've been around for 50 years. It must be, by now, the government has some clue about whether they're safe. But again, research here is contested in a way that will suggest to many of you, you need to question your assumption that you came into this evening holding with firm belief, because how could any of us live without our cell phones? Now you are less sure. Now the point of both cases is to recognize the way the confidence is affected by your knowing that money is in the midst of the judgment I report. Not money in some abstract sense, it's money in the wrong place that leads you to question the underlying claim that might be made in advance in support of that money. It is the mere presence of money that creates this lack of trust, this mere presence that suggests some lack of independence. And so the lesson here, too, is to maintain confidence, to maintain trust. For institutions that must depend upon confidence and trust, we have to secure the right kind of independence, to secure the independence, to secure the proper dependence, and to avoid the kind of dependencies that we as humans can't help but believe undermine the integrity of the institution that relies upon those resources. Those are the two ideas. Okay, I want to use those ideas now to make this argument. So the rap on this institution is that it's corrupt, that it's filled with the likes of Rob Blagojevich. Actually, he never made it to the institution. He was able to buy his way to the Senate. So Randy Duke Cunningham's or William Jefferson's criminals who traffic with brown paper bags filled with cash, engaging in quid pro quo bribery. And that attitude leads 46% of Americans to believe that most in Congress are corrupt. Now, in this sense of corruption, I want to say most Americans are wrong. The institution of Congress is not filled with people like Rob Blagojevich. Indeed, I agree with my colleague Dennis Thompson, who says that the integrity and competence of our institution of Congress today is as high as it's ever been. So if we have to ask, as some think we must ask, well, I want to say neither is our Congress filled with crooks. But there is an important sense of corruption that does predicate properly of Congress. A sense of corruption, we can say, that is true of Congress. And it's not a corruption of the people of Congress, it's a corruption of the institution itself. It's a version of institutional corruption. And we can see that relative to the framers' conception of what they were giving us when they gave us Congress. The framers drafted a constitution that promised us a republic. But by a republic, what they meant was a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, what they explained in Federalist 52 they meant was a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Okay, so here's their model of government. We have the people, we have the government. I do my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that, right? The people and the government, this marionette relationship that creates the dependence that assures that when they act in light of their masters, we the masters. Here's the problem. Congress has evolved a different dependence. It's no longer a dependence upon the people alone, it's increasingly a dependence upon the funders. As members spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power, they develop, as any of us would, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000, in light of what they know will make it easier for them to raise money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now, the point is that this is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from the dependence upon the people alone, because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. 0.26%. I often get people who say, you're a lawyer, you don't know about percentages. But no, I really mean 0.26%. 1/4% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional election. 0.05% give the maximum amount to any congressional candidate. 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, give $10,000 or more in an election cycle. And in this Republican presidential election cycle, 0.000063%, 196 Americans have given more than 80% of the money that has been spent in super PAC expenditures so far. So the Occupy Wall Street people are so proud of their we are the 99%, bad marketing. They should be saying we are the 99.74%, or we are the 99.95%, or we are the 99.99%, or we are the 99.9999937% who don't have the influence that the 0.26, 0.05, 0.01, 0.000063%, depending on your number, have, because we don't fund the elections the way they do. Now, this is, the Supreme Court doesn't get this yet, but it will. This is corruption. It is not corruption in the brown paper bag sense of corruption. It's not corruption in the Rob Blagojevich sense of corruption. There's no criminal activity in anything that I'm describing here. This is corruption relative to the framers' baseline of a Congress dependent upon the people alone. It is dependence corruption. And this corruption has an effect. Number one, it leads Americans to believe, and I think Americans are right to believe, but Americans believe that, quote, money buys results in Congress. For a poll that we did for my book, Republic Lost, we found that 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress. A little bit higher among Democrats than Republicans, but I guarantee you before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Democrats as Republicans. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing we all agree upon as Americans. Money buys results in Congress. Leading to point number two, that belief erodes trust in this institution of Congress. Gallup reported last year that 11% of Americans had confidence in Congress. They then were happy to report that went up to 12%. The New York Times then said it went down to 9%. So 9% of Americans have confidence in Congress. 9%, right? We have to put that in some context. There were certainly a higher percentage of Americans who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in our Congress today. And that leads to point number three. This low trust erodes participation in the institution. Rock the Vote, which registers and turns out young voters, and registered the largest number of young voters in the history of voting in the United States in 2008, and I think certainly, therefore, delivered the election for Barack Obama, found in 2010 that a significant portion of their young voters were not going to vote. And so they polled them. And the number one reason they found by far, 2-1 over the second highest reason was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of Americans who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in part at least because of this belief. Okay, that's point one. Here's point two. So what, in fact, could we do about this? How could we restore this independence of this institution? And my view is the only way to restore that independence is to restore the proper dependence. That if we have a systemic problem here, that the funders are not the people, we need a systemic solution, which is to make it so the funders are the people. To give them away, I know that looks like give Congress away, and I know lots of people would like to do that, but I don't mean give Congress away, I mean give Congress a way to fund without Faust, without selling their souls and thereby alienating most America because we believe they have sold their souls in exchange for their campaign contributions. And the one way to do this, and I increasingly think the only way to do this, is to embrace an idea that I want to call here citizen-funded campaigns. Okay, so what could citizen-funded campaigns mean? The first thing we have to accept, and people in Silicon Valley push back on this idea because they think the internet could make campaigns free, right? But the first thing we have to accept is that we have to find a way to fund campaigns. Campaigns cost money. But the question we have to ask is by whom? Should they be funded by citizens or by non-citizens? Non-citizens, like the Chinese or the French? Or whether or not corporations are persons, nobody has ever said they are citizens of the United States. So when you ask most people about citizens versus non-citizens, most people say, well, that's easy, citizens. Citizens should be funding our campaigns. And if citizens should be funding campaigns, that leads to the second question, which citizens? Some citizens or all citizens? Some citizens in the sense of a selection of us or everyone? Well, citizens-funded campaigns say, actually, citizens are funding, but the different flavors of citizens funding can be shown by looking at the different ways in which we funded elections. So you could look at our current way of funding elections, which is a way of funding the election so that some citizens fund the campaigns. So we have large dollar-funded campaigns funded by a small percentage of Americans, the 0.26, the 0.05, or the 0.01%. And that produces this radically unequal influence on the basis of citizens. Indeed, if you think about the difference between the voter election, where we actually show up and cast a vote, and the money election, which happens continuously as we decide each day whether to send money into candidates so that they can use that to get people to vote for them. What's puzzling about the American constitutional regime is that we have a constitutional requirement to make sure that regardless of income level, the vote, the weight of your vote, is almost identical to the weight of the vote of anybody else. If districts are drawn so that the weight of votes in one part of a state are more significant than the weight of votes in another part of the state, the Constitution requires we redraw those lines to make sure that it's effectively equal across citizens. But when you shift to the money election, the election that we conduct every day as we decide whether to send money into candidates to help them fund their campaigns, we see a radical difference in the scope of influence. There's still people here, they're just barely visible at that level. Indeed, we've just calculated, my colleague Paul Jorgensen, who is from the University of Oklahoma, just calculated that the ratio of per capita contributions of the 1% of Americans versus the 99% is 11 times as high. The 1% gives per capita 11 times more than the rest of America. So in this system, we fund campaigns by the tiniest slice of the 1%. This is the vision of this way of funding citizen-funded campaigns. And so this is not the picture of citizen-funded campaigns I'd like to push. Now this leads some people to what you could think of as the opposite of citizen-funded campaigns of the small variety. What the FEC runs when it runs, for example, public funding of presidential elections, a system which is hated by most Americans because most Americans look at it and feel it's arbitrary. It decides that a candidate gets $20 million or $40 million. And another problem that conservatives had with this version of public funding is that it forces me to use my money to subsidize your political speech. Why should my money be used to support your political speech if I disagree with you? And it also has produced this bloated and bureaucratic form of allocation of money governing elections, which is not appealing to most Americans as they think about a way of running our system for selecting our government. So these two extremes, neither of them seem very appealing from the perspective of the democracy our framers intended us to have. Well, as you can see, there's room in the middle here. So let's talk about what citizen-funded elections of all citizens might look like. And these are systems that are increasingly popping up around the country where voluntary small dollar funded campaigns are able to win without ever taking large contributions from anyone. These are systems where candidates opt into accepting small dollar contributions only, and then the system finds a way to amplify those contributions so that you can afford to run winning campaigns, never taking contributions larger than the contributions of $100 per citizen. Now, there are many versions of this. 3 states, Arizona, Maine, and Connecticut, have an operating system for the legislature, Connecticut including the governor. And when Connecticut adopted its system, in its first year, 78% of representatives were elected using the small dollar funded system, Republicans and Democrats alike, elected never having to take any large contributions in order to run a winning campaign in the state of Connecticut. In the fall of 2010, the House of Representatives came very close to passing an equivalent at the federal level. But these versions of small dollar funded elections still fall afoul of the conservatives' concern that my money is being used to support speech I don't believe in. And they also fall afoul of the concern that some arbitrary bureaucratic number is being used to decide how much people get to run their elections. So in my book, Republic Lost, I tried to revise this system in light of these conservative concerns. So I've proposed what I call the Grant and Franklin Project. So here's how the Grant and Franklin Project works. You have to start with an assumption, which I could prove, but let's just take it as an assumption, that all Americans, quote, contribute, it's a tax, so it's not really a contribution, but let's say contribute $50 to the federal treasury, at least $50. Now, they could be giving it an income tax or payroll tax or social security tax or cigarette tax or gasoline tax, whatever. At least $50 from all of us goes to the federal government. So this system says, we take that first $50 of our money and we rebate it back to the citizen in the form of a democracy voucher. And that voucher, the citizen can then use to give to any candidate running for Congress, as long as that candidate agrees to fund his or her campaign with vouchers only, plus contributions from individuals limited to $100 per citizen. So vouchers, $50 a grant, and Franklin's $100 per citizen. All right, now, $50 a voter is $7 billion in the federal election system. That's more than 3 times the total amount raised and spent in 2010. So $50 in voter 3 times means it's real money in the system. But the critical fact is it's representative money in the system. It's money from all of us in the system. And if we had an election where money was coming from all of us, then the dependency upon money would be a dependency upon all of us. So this is the sense in which I think we should begin to think about citizen-funded elections. Citizen-funded elections so that all citizens are participating in the funding elections, just like all citizens are supposed to be participating in the electing of representatives. Small dollars, representative distributions, reestablishing what we should think of as this dependency. Now the key thing is to think about what this would buy us, what we would get. If we had a system like the Grant and Franklin project, or any system where small dollar contributions only were used to fund elections, then we could believe, as we all want to believe, that whenever Congress did something stupid, and I guarantee they would do something stupid, but whenever they did something stupid, we would think either it's because there are too many Democrats or too many Republicans, but we would not think it was because of the money, because we have removed from this frame the corrupting influence of money by making it so nobody could credibly believe decisions were being made on the basis of contributions from the tiniest slice of the 1%. And this would buy us trust. And if we had trust, it might buy us participation. And if we had participation, it might buy us a restoration of this framers' model of a government dependent upon the people alone. That's citizen-funded campaigns. Now, would that be enough? Given the non-citizen-funded super PACs that have exploded across our republic, would citizen-funded campaigns be enough against them? And the answer to that question, I think, is plainly, obviously, no. We've entered this age of the super PAC, not just the kind of fun super PACs like the Colbert super PAC, but super PACs that engage in a certain kind of very troubling dynamic. This is Tony Soprano, in case you didn't recognize him here. Super PAC dynamic that was explained to me by Evan Bayh, an event that I was participating with him in Washington, when he was explaining to somebody who said, we don't actually have any good data to support the idea that money is affecting results in Congress. Evan Bayh rolled his eyes, former senator from Indiana, and he said, you have no idea about how Citizens United, the decision that gave us the birth of super PACs, have changed politics in Washington. He said it used to be the case that an incumbent in Washington could almost guarantee his reelection and thereby love the system because the system made it so that he had the resources and understanding necessary to keep the faith of the people. But now the world is such that 30 days before an election, the biggest fear incumbents have is that some super PAC will come in and drop $1 million on the other side. And at that point, what can the incumbent do, Evan Bayh said. And just putting his answer in a little bit more compelling frame, this is what he said. He said, well, what an incumbent's got to do is he's got to buy super PAC insurance. Super PAC insurance meaning so when somebody comes in and drops a bomb on one side, the insurance comes in and spends about the same amount of money on the other side, negating, equaling out the effect of the super PAC money. But how do you buy insurance? Well, this is something all of us are quite familiar with. You have to pay your premium in advance. You have to pay your premium in advance. So how does a member of Congress or a senator pay his premium in advance? Well, he does what the people with super PAC money are likely to want him to do in order to give them a reason to support that senator. We'd like to help you, Senator, but we can only help people who support us at 80% of our scorecard. Then the senator has something to aim at because he knows what he's got to do in order to guarantee that when that bomb is dropped, there's somebody willing to come in and drop a bomb on the other side. And this is the incredibly genius character of this architecture. Without even spending $1, the super PACs secure senators and representatives who behave in the way they want them to behave, just to guarantee that the insurance premium is paid so that when push comes to shove, they will support them in an election. This is what Citizens United gave us. This is a protection racket. It's a protection racket because the incumbents know the only way they guarantee their protection is to please the 0.0000063% of America, or you pick your number. I guarantee it's less than 0.01% of America who's in the position of funding these super PACs. And what this means is that we ultimately will need something more than just citizen-funded campaigns. We ultimately will need something that the Article 5 of our Constitution gives us, the ability to amend the Constitution. If the Supreme Court sticks on its Citizens United decision, and it's a law school, so I can drop a footnote. I think there's a reason to think they're not going to stick on it. But up from the footnote, if they stick, then we need an amendment. Clause 2 of the amendment has to say something like this: Congress shall have the power to limit but not to ban independent political expenditures within 90 days of an election. I don't think Congress should ever have the power to ban anybody from saying anything. That was the mistake of BICRA, the statute that was struck down by the Supreme Court in Citizens United. But they do have to have the power to limit so that we don't have this economy where candidates are not only shape-shifting to raise money, but they are shape-shifting to secure the super PAC insurance they need in order to win or to stay into office. Both of these changes are going to be essential. Some version of funding with small dollar contributions only, and some ability to limit independent expenditures. Both of these are going to be necessary to make trust here possible. Okay, now here's the fundamental and hardest question. Is it possible to produce these two changes? And I think the honest answer is it's not clear. Because this process has evolved so far that it's not clear the institution of Congress has the capacity to fix itself. This was driven home most forcefully for me in an interview I had with Jim Cooper, as a Democrat from Tennessee. He's been in Congress for as long as all but about 20 other members of Congress, so he has perspective on the institution. And his fundamental claim about Congress is how it's radically changed in just the past 20 years. And he said the core of that change is that Congress has become a farm league for K Street, where the lobbyists work. He says increasingly members and staffers and bureaucrats have a common business model focused on their life after government. Think foreign prince, except the prince is no longer foreign, the prince is domestic. Life after government, life as lobbyists. Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of the Senate left to become lobbyists, 42% of the members of the House, and those numbers have only gone up. And as United Republic calculated just last month, the average salary increase for a congressman going from Capitol Hill to K Street is 1,452%. This is a system where everybody in that beltway depends upon the system surviving. So how could we ever imagine them changing this system? And the honest answer is, we don't know whether it's possible to get them to change the system. But I do think we know how that change starts. And it starts with a certain kind of recognition. recognition inspired for me by Henry David Thoreau. 1846, while living at Walden Pond, Thoreau wrote on Walden, and in On Walden he says, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the roots." Call that one a root striker. A root striker. And this is the recognition. It's a recognition that recognizes that if we look at all of the problems that we might identify from the left and the right, whether it's healthcare reform for the left or government bailouts for the right, whether it's climate change legislation for the left or a complex tax system for the right, whether it's financial reform for the left or financial reform for the right, what we recognize when we connect these dots is that we're going to get no change in any of these issues until we change this system. And that recognition then remembers that we might be Charlie Brown and Lucy might have been doing this for many, many election cycles, but politicians time and time again have told us this. Most recently, this politician who challenged us exactly 4 years ago this month to, quote, take up the fight. As he said, if we're not willing to take up that fight, the fight to change the way Washington works, talking about the influence of lobbyists and the way they control the agenda of Washington, then real change, as he said, change that will make a lasting difference in the lives of ordinary Americans, will keep getting blocked by the defenders of the status quo. They've told us this again and again, yet once they get to office, they forget this and move back to the ordinary system. Yet now, in this election, there's a conspiracy of silence about this issue. Governor Romney is not going to talk about this issue, having beaten his opponents 4-1 in spending. All that gold just glitters in his eyes. President Obama is not going to talk about this issue. I think he genuinely wishes we lived in a world where money didn't buy results in Congress, but after spending 3 years just wishing, it'd be a little bit too embarrassing for him to raise this issue now. So this conspiracy of silence means that in this election cycle, in the presidential election cycle, this issue is invisible. And it means that we have to make manifest the recognition that people have about this root. We have to show them that we get it. And we begin by making it visible, making visible a commitment to doing something about this root. So a bunch of us have organized this as the beginning of this site, this anti-corruption pledge, where at this site you can identify the elements that you think are necessary to reform this system. Provide that elections are publicly funded, limit political independent expenditures, close the revolving door, reaffirm that when the Declaration of Independence spoke of entities endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, they were speaking of persons only. You pick, tell us which ones are important, and then you have a way of reporting back to your friends and to the public that you have made this commitment. And when 10 million Americans make this commitment, then we have 10 million soldiers who can turn around and say to their representatives, now we want you to make the same commitment too, to make visible this issue and to force it back into the center of this political debate, to make it impossible for them to ignore this issue anymore. But even then, is it possible? And let me end then with a story that was prompted at one of these talks in Dartmouth. So I finished my talk, and a woman stood up and said to me, "You've convinced me, Professor. You convinced me that this is impossible. There's nothing we can do. There's no way to fix this republic." And as I write in my book, at that moment when she said this, I had this image in my head. And I thought of a doctor coming to me and saying about my then 8-year-old son, your son has terminal brain cancer, and there's nothing you can do. And I thought, would I do nothing? Would I just sit there, accept it? And that led me to the obvious recognition about what love means in our lives. What love means in our lives is the willingness to act in the face of absolute impossibility. Its impossibility means nothing. It's irrelevant to us. And when you have that recognition about love, and you spin that understanding of love right around to love of country, we have an answer to the plausible, probably true claim that it's impossible to fix this republic. There are people who fling themselves to other parts of the world and risk their lives on arguments that are far more obscure in its relation to our democracy than anything I've said tonight. They do that for love of country. And if we all, on the left and the right, can recognize this same love of country in the context of this fight to restore a republic we could have faith in again, that will not destroy the lives of our children as this republic now is in its completely irresponsible approach to every fundamental issue that faces us, if we can find that love and attack this corruption with that passion, then there is a chance we could restore the independence and the integrity of the government our framers gave us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lessig. Professor Lessig has agreed to answer some questions, so we'll throw it open to the audience.
So it's a law school, and I will cold call on you if you don't.
Well, I was listening to NPR News when I'm working, and I heard you speaking on that, and then I come down here to hear you.
Great.
You're the only one I've heard so far that even has a hope of maybe something we can do. It's like you say, it seems like most people that don't even watch the news, they don't even know what's going on. They haven't got a clue, and I'm thinking, when you said Timmy and signatures, basically we got to get enough people that's going to get on there. But because there's not a constitutional thing that we can sign, like, you get enough signatures, you can call a grand jury, but you can't get signatures to force Congress to make it new. We just have to get enough people together and put it in paper.
Well, first, I appreciate you coming after hearing me on NPR. It's important that places like this invite a broad range of people to this conversation. And the commitment that I have is that this has got to be a fight that people from all across the political spectrum are on the same page about. Now, the framers of our Constitution had two ways to amend the Constitution. One of them is Congress gets to propose an amendment. But the second, somebody said when that was being debated, what if Congress is the problem? So they said, well, that's a good point. What we need is then a second way to amend the Constitution. And so the Constitution has a second provision. It says states can call on Congress, pass a resolution calling on Congress to propose a convention for the purpose of proposing amendments that then have to be ratified by 38 states. So there is, in fact, a way that people at the state level can begin to force their state legislature to pass a resolution that calls on Congress to have a convention. Now, the interesting politics of that is the reason for calling the convention don't have to be the same. So some states have already passed resolutions calling on Congress to propose a convention for the purpose of considering a balanced budget amendment or an amendment that limits the debt. Hawaii right now is considering a resolution to call on Congress to call a convention for the purpose of addressing these corruption issues. So there's a procedure, if we can get people to wake up to it and do something about it. But what it takes is giving them, I think, a reason to believe there's something that can happen. So I agree with you. Most people don't understand any of this. Not because they're stupid, because they have other things to do in their lives. And why waste their time? If money buys results, why waste your time if you don't have the money? But if you can give them something to hope for, some reason why it could be different, then I think they have a reason to get involved and to do something. And if they do, they actually could bring about the change that I think we would need here. Yes, sir.
Well, how about this as an option? Because I have to say that I agree with your analysis, but I am as equally depressed as a woman. And though I like the sentiment that, yes, we all need to love the country as we would our child, no matter what the circumstances, it seems to me it would be much more possible to affect change if you propose something, I think, fairly dangerous. But it seems to be much more potentially effective, and that is, I think economic collapse is, or coming very close, and actually suffering the consequences of economic collapse would clue people into there's a real problem with the system. Because I found myself with this most recent collapse, near collapse on Wall Street, kind of perversely hoping that people really would feel the bite of that. Because I figured, okay, if they don't, what's going to happen is you're going to get kind of phony legislative solutions for this. And I have to say, I think that's exactly what happened. So I don't know, what about proposing economic collapse as a...
Well, you know, the good parts of America that think we did have economic collapse.
Yeah.
Not Wall Street.
I agree with that. But we
Wall
didn't
Street's got off pretty good,
Yeah.
but bunches of America believes we did have economic collapse.
I have unemployed relatives who would agree with me.
Yeah.
So.
And it really, I think, is terrifying to see what happened in the context of the economic collapse. You know, so it's one thing to say that until 2008, congressmen on the left and the right were bullied into deregulating financial services sector. Right? You know, it's kind of surprising they were willing to do it, but it's not totally surprising because at the same time, all of the leading academics in the world were marching up to Capitol Hill and telling them deregulation is the solution. Now, of course, those economists were not telling Capitol Hill that they were being paid by Wall Street to say that. But that's what they said, and as Democrats and Republicans saw that the more they deregulated, the more money that came from Wall Street, everybody was happy to see deregulation. So that's what they did. But what's really astonishing to me, really scary to me, is after 2008, after we have the worst crisis since the Depression, after everybody independent of that crisis says, it's because of the misregulation, people on the left and right. You know, Richard Posner, judge in the Seventh Circuit, writes 2 books pointing to the mistake of deregulation that led to this crisis. After the dean of deregulation, the former Ayn Randian Alan Greenspan, head of the Federal Reserve, said that he was mistaken in believing that the banks would respond in a sensible way in the context of this kind of incentives to cheat. After all of that, Wall Street still has the power to blackmail both the Republicans and the Democrats alike into passing a reform bill that doesn't reform the core problem to our financial system, which is banks are too big to fail. If banks are too big to fail in 2008, they're only too bigger to fail today. And this is because we didn't address the fundamental problem of this crisis. Now, this is scary because it is literally the first time in American history that the financial services sector has had the power to block reform after a financial crisis. Now, we've had financial crises many, many times in American history. The most dramatic one after the Depression led to the New Deal regulation changes. Those regulation changes radically changed Wall Street. Wall Street couldn't block them. And because of those changes, we had 50 years of peace, 50 years of a stable financial market. And then as they undid those financial reforms, we then got the instability we had again, and now Wall Street could block it. So I think in 2007, I might have entertained the idea that, you know, financial collapse will get us the kind of resolve that we have, but I look at this consequence of this collapse and I say, where is the outrage that translates into forcing fundamental change into the system? And the fundamental change that was forced through the Tea Party finally articulated itself not on the side of restoring power to the people and destroying the power of the lobbyists, but reinforcing the power of the lobbyists, right? Because they oppose every change that might weaken the ability of lobbyists to leverage their power to control regulation inside of Washington. So I don't think there's a silver bullet in that extremely painful. I think it's got to start with us convincing each other that this is the change that we need. It's got to be obvious to everybody. And that whenever a politician stands up and speaks, you ask him first about this question, until they're just too embarrassed to not be talking about this question. And when we can get all of them embarrassed because we're demanding that they talk about this question again and again and again, then we begin to get some politicians who are keen to take this up as a cause and actually deliver something about it. Assert that.
You hinted that the Citizens United case might be revisited. Could you expand on that?
So the Montana Supreme Court recently decided a case evaluating a Montana law which basically banned all corporate spending in Montana political elections. And the opinion of the Montana Supreme Court basically says, well, Citizens United might be right for the United States, but Montana has a very special history, an extraordinarily corrupt history of Montana mining companies owning the politicians in the most grotesque way imaginable. And in light of that history, this law is constitutional in Montana. It was constitutional when passed, and just because it was effective in achieving its objective, produced non-corrupt government in Montana, doesn't mean that it's all of a sudden unconstitutional. They said, you know, if you pass a law against murder and the murder rate goes down, it then doesn't become unconstitutional to have the law against murder. It's the law that produced that. So that's what we've done in Montana. Well, as the dissenting judges, you know, a lot of honorable judges dissented in that case, and they said, look, we hate Citizens United, but there's no way to distinguish this case from Citizens United. And if Citizens United is the law of the land, then Citizens United requires that we strike this law down. The Supreme Court has basically signaled they are going to review that decision. And so it will go back to the Supreme Court, and it will be heard in the fall. The decision will come out after this election. But my bet is that Justice Kennedy, the key swing vote, might be brought around to recognize the mistake. And the mistake is that his conception of corruption is too narrow. That, you know, he has a view of corruption that's looking at Rod Blagojevich's, but that wasn't the framers' concern. They didn't care about Rod Blagojevich's. You know, they thought there'd always be Rod Blagojevich's. That's not the problem. The question is creating an institution that was independent enough. And he should be able to see that that institution is threatened at the federal level with an election where, 200 people are contributing 80% of the money that's driving super PACs in this election cycle. Now, what would he have to do? This is why I think there's a great opportunity. He doesn't actually have to say that Citizens United was wrong on the facts. I think that the First Amendment must protect the right of a nonprofit film company, which is what Citizens United was, to use their money to promote their film. That has nothing to do with the corruption I'm talking about. So the mistake in that law, in that case, was not in the application to the particular party. It was in the principle that they announced that make it sound as if Congress could do nothing about any money at all, that there was no difference between a nonprofit film company and Exxon. You know, like those were the same entities. You know, normal people look at them and they say, these look like different things to me. But, you know, after you go through law school, you know, that ability to see that difference has been erased. And you now see them all as basically the same thing. And under the principle the Supreme Court articulated, the thing that protects the nonprofit film company protects Exxon. But there's no reason that you have to adopt that position. And I think Kennedy might be brought around to recognize the great damage that this has done to this republic, and why his principles of free speech don't actually have to include that damage, and he might be led to step back from it. I mean, you know, I think I'm the only person who believes that, so I don't think you should bet the bank on that, but I do have faith. So, yes, sir.
Similar along the lines of that, is a 90-day bubble on your 28th Amendment, do you think that would really be effective?
I don't know whether 90 is the right number. There's a number that's the right number. But I do think it would be effective to create the bubble around this. Because the real thing people are worried about, the thing that makes them so anxious, is the speech in a context where there's no effective way to respond. Right? So if you like quiet down a period. You know, for example, when you go into a voting booth right now, you know, there's this chute of silence. You know, you cross a point where there's no more signs. You just walk into the voting booth and you vote. And those regulations that say that, you know, there can't be politicking all the way to the voting booth are the same kind of point here. It's like there has to be a time when we as citizens are just listening to the candidates spending their money inside their campaigns, but these independent, you know, super PAC-like expenditures just should not be part of that quiet time before the election. Now, again, most people who are critical of Citizens United say they should never be allowed to speak at all. Like, we should just shut corporations up. My view is, corporations, the Chinese, dolphins, everybody has a right to say what they believe, and we ought to encourage them to say what they believe. So the point is not about silencing them. The point is just to make sure that we have an orderly election period where people can be reasoning and thinking about what the things are about without, the kind of games that we see super PAC spending producing right now. All the way in the back.
In the wake of Citizens United, a lot of people have been calling out to increase disclosure requirements, on political spending, so that people can make informed decisions about, who they're going to support, and knowing where their money goes. And you yourself have called out for greater transparency. Do you think that maybe increased transparency, increased disclosure could be an effective remedy to this?
So, you remember when the Deepwater Horizon disaster happened? And then they had this really cool webcam down there. So you could see like muck spewing into the Gulf. And I was for that webcam. I thought it was a great thing to be able to see the muck that was spewing into the Gulf. But I think there's a category mistake to think that what we need is now a high-def webcam so we can see the muck more clearly. What we need is no muck spewing into the Gulf. That's the solution. So of course, in a world where we have muck spewing into the political system, I want to see that as clearly as I can. And the idea that super PACs can spend their money, they get their donations anonymously, which they can. The Supreme Court didn't understand that. It took Stephen Colbert to explain that to the nation. But the way the laws are structured, if you launder your money through a C4, which is a certain kind of nonprofit, you contribute to the C4 doesn't have to disclose its contributors, then the C4 can contribute to the super PAC so that you launder this anonymous money into the system. That's terrible, of course. I think it's outrageous. But on the other side of me thinks, how much better off would we be if we knew precisely all of that? Not much. It would just convince more people to say that it's impossible. Like, you would be more convinced that money was buying results in Congress, right? So I firmly oppose the idea that transparency is a solution. Transparency is necessary as a way to get us, maybe, to a place that gets us excited enough to make a change. But I think transparency advocates have to be open to the fact that maybe transparency also just convinces us it's hopeless. It might be that too much transparency actually gets us over the cliff in the sense of having any resolve to want to solve the problem. So I think we constantly have to talk about transparency and reform. Transparency is important, but it's got to go hand in hand with reform. As Harvey Milk used to say in California, you got to give them hope. You got to give them hope. There's got to be a reason to be out there fighting. Otherwise, you're going to have this kind of reaction. There's no reason to do anything here. You got to give them a reason to want to do something. And transparency is not that reason.
Let's do two more questions.
Right here, sir.
Would a one-chamber solution be to repeal the 17th Amendment to restore independence in the Senate?
Well, so the 17th Amendment, which made it so the Senate was elected as opposed to appointed, was actually passed literally 100 years ago. 100 years ago, we had the most, if you look at American history, basically every 100 years we hit this issue. Jefferson thought that his election signaled the second great American revolution. It was a revolution against privilege, and his election was to end that kind of privilege inside of our system, to end that corruption of the Republican ideals. 100 years later, we have the election of 1912. There are 4 candidates in that election. A socialist, Eugene Debs, a stand-pat Republican, William Howard Taft, and Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt and Wilson both call themselves progressives, but they're very different progressives. Progressives didn't really mean liberal. Progressives meant people who wanted to change the system, and the thing they were focused on was the corruption of the system, like corruption in the old-fashioned way, bribery, Blagojevich corruption. And the Senate was, in their view, the source of that corruption, because basically people just bought their Senate seats, and they used their Senate seats, trading it for wealth to private wealth for the influence that they could leverage. So the progressives thought direct election would be a better way to avoid that kind of corruption. And there's related to this constitutional convention idea, that is the only time we came close to a constitutional convention. Because there was a constant push for people to make the Senate elected, and there's a big pushback against making the Senate elected inside the Senate. Obviously, they didn't want to be elected. So when states came within one vote of calling for a convention, they terrified Congress. Like, what the hell will they do if there's a convention? So when they came within one vote, they quickly sent out the amendment that led to the 17th Amendment being passed and making the Senate elected. Now, I think we've seen that that wasn't the solution to the corruption problem. And I've told you what I think the solutions to the corruption problem look like. But if you wanted to tinker with the 17th Amendment, I'm not going to wage a campaign in favor of it. But if you went back on the 17th Amendment, the reason to go back on it is that the Senate could be a better protector of states' rights if it was more directly tied to the interests of the states. But I would never support going back to the original vision that the legislature appointed the senator. It should be the governor who appoints the senator. So when the senator is corrupt, we know who to blame. The problem with the old system was that when the senator was corrupt, it was like, who are you going to punish for that? Nobody. So if we went back on the 17th Amendment and you wanted to use it as a way to protect states' rights, as a Democrat, I'm a little worried about that, but as an American, I'm not worried about that. Okay, that's fine. But just make it so we can hold somebody responsible for the inevitable temptation to corruption. Okay, you have the last question. It's got to be really good.
It may not be, but the transparency issue seems to me it only works against the people who have less to contribute. The working guy who maybe despises the politics of his employer. And I did politics for a long, long time in the fields of the Democratic Party, and the more transparent, meaning the more opportunity employers got to see reports of who was contributing, the harder it became to raise that smaller contribution and get a big participation. So I'm not a big fan of this transparency. Everybody can see the results, and these guys are so proud of what they do, they reveal themselves.
Yeah, so there's been a big pushback in a couple contexts about transparency there. The Supreme Court has considered this, and they basically said there's no right to non-transparency. So when you sign a petition calling for, a controversial amendment to your state constitution, your signature is a public act. And I guess that I understand the concern, and I don't see any reason under my voucher program that the person you give your voucher to needs to be a public record. No, you need to be able to verify that the person got your contribution, perhaps, but nobody else needs to know that. So I'm happy with non-transparency at that level. And interestingly, if you think about non-transparency as a device, we have embraced non-transparency as a means to fighting corruption in our past. So in the 19th century, voting was public, completely transparent. What that did was made it easy to sell votes. Because you say, okay, I'll vote for your guy, you pay me $5. So they went into the room, they watched to make sure you raised your hand at the right time. You raised your hand at the right time, then he paid you $5. Then the idea came, well, let's make voting secret. If we made it secret, then you could still try to engage in a contract to sell your vote for $5, but you might be selling your vote for $5 to 5 different people. So nobody has a reason to believe you because they can't verify that in fact you did that. So transparency was a device to facilitate the destruction of the vote buying market. And some people, like my colleague Bruce Ackerman at Yale, and Ian Ayers, have proposed anonymous donation booths as a way to deal with the problem of corruption in politics. So the idea is you can give to whomever you want, but we make it so it's anonymous, really effectively anonymous. Now, you don't believe it's possible to make it anonymous. If we had a lot of time, I could go into how, I could convince you, believe me, I could convince you it really could be anonymous. But the problem with that is it might work too well, in the sense that, so Florida tried this for judges. They had a system where contributions to judges would be anonymized. Nobody gave. So it might be if you have a system where contributions are completely anonymized, we don't have enough money inside the political system. So I understand your concern, and I think we have to be sensitive to it. But so long as we have a system where everybody's giving unlimited amounts of money, I think we can avoid it. Thank you so much for coming on.